Hey, what's up everybody? Killing for Company, my name's Kellen. Today we kind of have a little bit of a theme or response video. Don't even want to, we'll call it here, but essentially this is the result of, or this video is the result of two things that have happened within the past, month that kind of simultaneously came about. So one is I picked up the new release from Sadistic Ritual. This is called Enigma Boundless, or I'm sorry, The Enigma Boundless. And I picked it up at around the same time that Melanie came on the heavy Metallurgy Friday night stream with Alan and Marty to talk about all things Thrash, their favorite Thrash records. So I'm gonna set this up by talking about a key question that Alan posed to the panel during that episode regarding Thrash, its history, and something that I kind of wanted to, I thought was missing from the conversation, and that came or was present in my mind because of this, what I've been sort of stirring over in regards to the recent Sadistic Ritual pickup. So what I'm going to do for you here is I'm going to play back a kind of some key moments from that stream, follow it up with a few sort of my favorite YouTubers and who had talked about the subject of this video briefly, and then I'm going to follow that up with sort of how Sadistic Ritual plays into it. So the first thing here, just so you know, we are listening to Sadistic Ritual, The Enigma Boundless in the background for you. Let me turn that up. But while that's playing in the background, I'm going to show you here the initial question that Alan posed to the panel.
I do want to follow up on something Melanie said, because I was thinking the exact same kind of thing earlier while pulling records. Thrash is a genre that we all love, lots of heavy metal fans love, but it really does feel like there has not been a lot of newer thrash that gets a ton of attention. That we all seem to go back to the same old classics. Even like you mentioned, Marty, you kind of feel like a lot of the stuff you pulled tonight is stuff you've pulled other times, and I was kind of feeling the same way a little bit. And then Melanie kind of made the same comment. What is it about thrash that it seems like it's a little stuck? Is there something inherent to that genre where it's just plateaued?
Okay, so that'll set us up. Now Alan goes on to further explain his interest or fascination in terms of what happened to thrash.
But why is that? What is it about? I mean, we see death metal has come back and proliferated and done well again. Black metal goes in cycles and diversifies and does well. Power metal, doom metal. These other genres, you have newer bands that come along that kind of keep it going. And thrash is the one that sometimes feels like you really are just listening to the super hits over and over and over again, because there's just nothing new that ever gets into rotation much. Any thoughts? So
the first panelist who jumps to it is Melanie, and I'll let her explain here, but her focus is on sort of production qualities, old classic thrash versus the new stuff.
I don't know, for these newer bands like Toxic Holocaust and Municipal Waste, like those are probably the bigger modern day thrash bands. I think for me, I just came late into listening to them. I was very judgmental because some of my all-time favorite bands are, Metallica, their first albums, and then, Anthrax and Creator and all the big house names of thrash. It just got to the point where I couldn't imagine listening to a modern thrash album with, the modern production that often goes into these newer modern sounding albums that are just too pristine and too crisp. And that's what I kind of just got to the point of where I didn't think that I could fully get into it.
And I think personally that makes total sense. I absolutely see where she's coming from. The next panelist who comes on and tackles this question is Marty.
I can't really elaborate much on why it's not gaining a solid foothold like it did, but being a child of that era, I would say that Thrash had a very enthusiastic run, a quick rise, and as soon as bands like Metallica, Testament, Slayer, Anthrax started getting to the major labels, what happens is what always happens in music media. These big labels are like, okay, we have to sign everybody that's wearing tight ripped up denim jeans and the high tops, the white high tops. And what it did was breed an incredible glut of bands that were tired. And by the time death metal started getting a foothold, it took the thrash template, bumped it up in aggression and speed, and it really put a pretty solid bullet to the skull of the thrash thing. Because let's be honest, I mean, I was getting tired of some of the shit that was coming out. I would buy records, it was just like, oh, it's okay, but it's just so blah.
Marty's point, all the sense in the world. Like a lot of genres, the party's, fun to begin with, but then everybody jumps in the pool and it gets pretty crowded and the water gets muddy soon enough. So last but not least, Alan, who initially posed the question, takes a swing at it and offers some insight in terms of where thrash sits under the broader umbrellas of traditional heavy metal versus extreme metal, and why that sort of has been problematic for the genre historically.
Thrash is in that weird middle ground now that, if somebody's looking for much more extreme stuff, thrash is going to be too safe for them. They're going to go for, the death or black metal stuff. At the same time, at the other end of the spectrum, if people are wanting something a little easier to listen to, they're going to go into a power metal direction probably. And thrash is going to still sound a little too, raw or aggressive to them. And so who's left there in the middle? A lot of folks that grew up with it, and have a strong connection to it and nostalgia for it. But yeah, it's hard to, it just seems like, it's a little hard for thrash to make waves the way it did once upon a time. But I mean, that said, it is still a beloved genre for a lot of folks. And again, I'm sure there are lots of good newer bands, pulling away out there that I just don't know about. So
good newer band that you need to know, Sadistic Ritual. But I absolutely think Alan's onto something here. And just to kind of open it to the viewers or anyone watching this who's familiar with two records that I think historically fall into the same sort of criticism and interpretation, maybe in a good and bad light. So that would be Metallica's Kill 'Em All and Possess Seven Churches. And the sort of the question or the premise of why they are potentially controversial is, I was wondering, is Metallica's Kill 'Em All to thrash what Seven Churches is to death metal, right? Are they sort of historically within the same lane in terms of being pioneering yet not fully realized? And the reason that's important is there's a 3-year time period that separates them essentially. So let's say you take the affirmative, right? That Kill 'Em All is to thrash as Seven Churches is to death metal. And that the way they are interpreted, meaning they aren't completely fully realized, right? Like there's still some new album or speed metal that's spilling into Kill 'Em All. It's not quite a pure thrash record. Seven Churches is maybe a really dark and obscure thrash record. Is not quite pure death metal. In the same way, the following year, the genre has undeniable classics. Even, Metallica's Ride the Lightning, I think no one is disputing as a pure classic thrash record. And there's other records from 1984 that would go, in the same consideration. You can say equally about, by the time we reach from 86 in Seven Churches to 87 in Scream Bloody Gore, no one's disputing that that record, that Scream Bloody Gore, is a classic death metal record, right? Either way you want to interpret that, I want to pose at least the idea that there's a 3-year difference between those sort of pinnacle or transition genres. That's a very little amount of time for thrash to be the most extreme thing out there. And if you were into underground metal and looking for the most extreme thing, I can understand why fans transition to death metal away from thrash that quickly. And it definitely separates itself, I would also say, from the traditional heavy metal camp. So I think Alan's onto something in terms of where does it sit, not only sonically but historically, in terms of the scope or canon of metal bands or metal genres. But that aside, what I felt was missing from the conversation was any insight or discourse surrounding the themes of thrash, because there's something that needs to be said about thrash being primarily, at least initially, an American contribution to heavy metal, and where America was in terms of its national identity at the beginning of the 1980s. You know, coming out of Vietnam and the Carter administration and inflation, recession, here comes Ronald Reagan and the 1980s. While I would say that the Cold War is not at its height, right, during the 1980s. I think I'm not a historian, but I would say that most, you know, if you go back and you look at 20th century history, the Soviet Union is in decline through the 1970s. Like, economically, they are in disarray. While, in terms of a military identity and sort of having global influence, there is still, an incredible sort of counter to how America sees itself. But the Reagan administration, I think, clearly identified itself as being anti-communist and wanted to make sure that America sort of reasserted itself as sort of the shining light for the world. And all the sort of economic sort of narratives that went along with that, right? But that meant reasserting many of the fears that came along with the Cold War. And a post-Vietnam sort of sense of militarism, distrust of the government, fear of not only military fallout, but also a potential distrust in American democracy and perceived notions of nationalism and patriotism. All of that comes out of from the 1970s into the 1980s. That combination, I think, is in a lot of ways would have informed the themes of thrash. Now, before you get too concerned this is going to be a history lesson instead of a conversation surrounding metal, I want to get to Chromium Dioxide, who essentially says everything I just did with a bit more humor and satire. So, cue Chromie D.
Are you sitting comfortably? All right, fantasy, reality. Clearly, Star Wars is a fictional universe. It's got origins from myths and folklore. We all know this. All the tropes are checked here. Ancient evils, dark overlords, orphan chosen ones, swashbuckling, chivalry, knights, princesses. That's 90% of every metal song up until Thrash shows up after its first year of college and thinks it fucking knows everything.
Just a little bit of context there. That was a video that Chromium Dioxide did surrounding the Star Wars is metal, Star Trek is punk conversation, which was brilliant. And the latter point of that, is thrash comes along and changes a lot of the traditional fantasy, horror, occult, hero worship kind of narratives, right? Everything that was sword and sorcery or sci-fi or, satanic panic 1970s shock and horror thrash comes around, and it is, you know, in a way that never was fully, like, there were definitely political songs regarding militarism, for example, in the history of, you know, heavy metal, or but this is the first time an entire subgenre sort of gathers around this theme. And it isn't exclusive to the American bands, right? I think, you know, there are other thrash acts from Germany and parts of Europe. It's not just an American phenomenon, but and the Cold War affected not just, you know, American politics, and it was a global concern, a global fear. But I digress. So with that sort of arrival of a very specific moment in time, political conversation, what I don't think thrash bands and heavy metal fans knew was what happens when this war ends. You know, as we get to the end of the 1980s and the fall of the Soviet Union, essentially, thrash loses a lot of its influence in terms of presenting a subgenre as the most extreme thing, not only sonically, but thematically. I think fear is dissipated there, and I've got more YouTubers here for you. Pat over at Ground Zero Salem, you know, he must have been thinking about the same stuff, but I know he wanted to talk about early 90s thrash. He did an amazing video. Brilliant stuff, like some of the best work he's ever done, in my opinion. All the praise in the world to a video he recently posted about early 90s thrash. Here's a moment where he highlights that transition out of the 1980s into the 90s, and essentially what happened to thrash thematically.
One of the most popular subjects in thrash, lyrically, other than, of course, you know, Satan and stuff like that, was nuclear war and toxic waste and shit like that. And those problems never went away. But I think with the Berlin Wall going down and the big baddies on the other side of the world, the USSR, you know, that massive titan of a nation fragmenting, I think that kind of brought a new sense of hope.
To Pat's point, what was once the most terrifying threat in the world, once that leaves, I think thrash is sort of lost in terms of how to present itself, purely based on the themes present within the music. And that sort of synergy, right, how we understand the sound of it, is indelibly linked to the history in which the genre emerged, in a way that I think Satanism or graphic violence, blasphemy, things that are far more extreme, they have progressed over the years, but they're all sort of drawing from, you know, a similar pool of history. It's not linked to a very specific time. So they've always been fears throughout, you know, history, and documented as such, where now the Cold War, you know, isn't the fear that we have. We don't fight wars in the same way we used to, and they don't sort of control us and frighten us the same way. So that is where my head was, and what I wanted to mention leading into this record. So Sadistic Ritual moves from, you know, I looked, the first sign that I thought something might be going on was when I noticed they had changed sort of the band logo from what it used to look like to how it was presented, you know, on this album. There is no Sadistic Ritual. There is just this sort of demonology sign at the middle of the record, and that is the only thing they really use to present an band identity here. I didn't know where they was going with it. Now I'll take a photo of this album artwork, but once I picked up the CD here and I went looking through the liner notes, reading the lyrics, not only was I able to identify what sort sort of conceptually what this band was trying to do, why they had presented, a visual aesthetic like this, which is not very traditional thrash, right? It doesn't. You don't even really know what to make of that. But what helped out was at the end of this record, or the end of the liner notes, I should say, there's a few paragraphs by Erica Frevel entitled Discourse. And, I'll take, there's a lot to read here, so I don't want to go through the entirety of it for you. But I'm just going to pull out an excerpt. So what she states here, I'll just jump into it. A prison cell of state-induced sadism against the breath of humanity, psychic control, mass surveillance, poisonous levels of drugs in the psyche of society, technological warfare against the very essence of the free man, coupled with the occult forces inherent within the technology of control, a mass ritual of the state. So it's an interesting blend. Like, they came into this record with a very specific concept in terms of taking occult demonology and blending it with a kind of thrash metal aesthetic of state control, surveillance, voyeurism, encroachment on freedom, in ways that those things are right now, I think, what we, in a very secular political conversation, are grappling with as a society in a way that we aren't dealing with within the Cold War. And that was refreshing to come across, that a band had sort of discovered inroads into using broader fears surrounding the fear of government, fear of society, what does freedom mean and what are the consequences of it. The background of that is, what does it feel like to be operating within sort of an idealistic democratic society in a downfall. It's dystopian in that regard. So all of those themes reminded me of what thrash in the 1980s was essentially exploring, but within its own social political context. This record, it's a breath of fresh air to not have to see necessarily a lot of the same imagery and themes surrounding warfare, surrounding militarism, which are still issues, right? None of that went away. Environmentalism is still a concern. I don't want toxic waste and nuclear warfare, right? But, I don't know how much that is really fresh and new in terms of ideas. I do like this band, however, pulling out modern concepts of what we are most terrified, or where we feel, limited in our capacity to be human and to live free lives. It's not necessarily like a very specific ideology, and I don't think that thrash bands are going to suddenly emerge to the forefront. But I did find it to be refreshing, at least. Like, this band gets it. They understand essentially the heritage of the genre thematically, and are trying to find ways to sort of recreate a conversation, or at least some kind of relationship to the world around them based on their influences in the 1980s. So that's all I really got for you here. And I just wanted to shout out, thank you so much for that conversation on Heavy Metallurgy. If you aren't paying attention to that channel with Alan and Marty, that's one of the best. I hope, honestly, that show becomes a dominant sort of narrative on the YouTube platform for metal. They're doing amazing work. Melanie Loves Death Metal is taking over that channel. She's does a great job, and it's a lot of fun to watch. Even though it's Melanie Loves Death Metal, she's got more than just death metal on her channel. And please, if you aren't already checking her out, please go do so. Chromium Dioxide is how do I praise that channel enough? He does not have enough subscribers, or is not treasured as much as he should be. That channel, he puts so much work in, and it is hilarious. A brilliant talent for dialogue. Please go, if you are not watching that channel, you are missing out on potentially the best show on YouTube, period, for my money, or time. Chromium, if you're watching this, if you ever do a stream and there are like super chats involved, I'll be sending your money your way for sure. Keep that studio light, those studio lights on. Pat over at Ground Zero Salem, I'm going to link to that video in the 90s, and Thrash. One of the I would not be doing this if it was not for Pat. There's a lot of amazing things I can say about his channel. What a true inspiration, and that 90s episode was absolutely brilliant. Like potentially the best contribution or insight into 90s thrash that I have ever seen. Not just in YouTube, but like in a very concerted way. You can tell he sat down to orchestrate that and get his point across in an incredibly organized way. So one, all the praise. That was such an amazing video. Unique content, and please check out Pat's channel. He's got a whole lot more than just thrash, right? So I'll link to all those videos. Thank you for stopping by and watching me over here killing for company. That's all I got for you guys. I'm gonna have another response video coming for you soon on the new wave of traditional heavy metal. But until then, I'll see you guys later. Bye.